Welcome, and thanks for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, we'd encourage you to please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. This really helps other folks find out about the podcast, our great guests, and the wisdom that they have to share. So without further ado, on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Julian Chambliss, Professor of History at Rollins College. How are you doing today, Julian?
I'm doing good, thanks.
Good. Now, I know you're actually on sabbatical at the moment, so you're probably enjoying yourself a little too much down there, but we'll allow you that for a few weeks here. But I wonder if you could kind of define what it is that you do, or at least in your own mind, and kind of how you came to be doing this work.
Well, I'm a professor of history at Rollins College. I'm also a coordinator of the Africa and African American Studies program. I got my PhD in United States history with a focus on urban America from the University of Florida. So my work primarily looks at questions of race, community, and identity, and urban development and urban popular culture. And I particularly look at real and imagined urban landscapes. In particular, the real landscapes are development of African American communities and Southern communities writ large after Reconstruction in the early 20th century. And sort of imaginary landscapes have a lot to do with perception of the urban experience from that late 19th century into the contemporary period, and particularly around questions of anxiety and aspirations in the urban environment. And I often talk about that in the context of comic books. So my dissertation was on planning activism in the South and the North, in particular looking at middle-class activism around urban beautification and community and betterment ideology. And a lot of my work on planning really sort of focused on those same ideas in the context of African American communities and community development in more contemporary landscapes around Orlando and sort of like Black diaspora experience, and how that sort of relates to the broader question of urbanization in the United States.
Well, I mean, we're based up here in Roanoke, and we've certainly have quite a history with that very subject you talk about in terms of our history and how it plays into race and displacement and beautification and all of those things that have left a rather unhealthy stain on our city. And I'm always intrigued to hear from more folks as to how that continues to impact folks to these days. But those impacts of those decisions and actions really have ripple effects that impact us in everything we do, don't they?
Oh, yeah. One of the things that I think we don't talk enough about is the importance of how people frame the urban environment as a success or failure, and how that's really filtered through questions of community, filtered through questions of identity. A lot of my work, especially in terms of like thinking about planning, has a lot to do with how questions of public welfare and public betterment are overlaid with questions of identity. And what we know about this in terms of like the history of urban development in the South and in the North, really nationally, is that questions about space are connected to questions about place, and those questions about place are narrativized around questions about the communities in those spaces. So the success or failure of certain urban spaces is often tied to how people perceive the communities within them. And of course, the problem here for African Americans, but really whatever racial minority that is sort of on the outside, is that their spaces are always sort of conceived of as a problematic space that needs to be erased or reformed, or erased. One of the things that I wrote about in my dissertation, and I continue to sort of think about it in the context of a place like Chicago, is that for a lot of people, when they perceive a lot of middle class people, right, sort of the commercial aspects of the city in particular have to be framed around questions of what can we do to bring value to the urban environment? And often that comes to questions of beautification, comes to the question of redevelopment, often around making a commercial city successful or accessible, more vibrant. And the spaces that are in play, those spaces that need to be transformed, often are associated with poor, but that often overlays, intersects, and aligns with minorities. In the early 20th century, in a place like Chicago, there were a number of not white minorities. African Americans were one of those, but when we look at the history, of course, there were so many sort of ethnic white groups, ethnic white minorities that were problematic for so many people in urban America in the early 20th century. And you can sort of see that in the documents that the Roma, the Polish, the Czechs, their spaces were the spaces that need to be reimagined to make a commercial city successful. And so those same ideas persist, but those groups whiten. And as we know, the transition from a sort of like ethnic white other to a kind of generic American allowed those groups to transition into the mainstream. But for those people who are racially too dark, they're not able to make that transition. So the stigma associated with their spaces remains a pertinent one. So Black and brown bodies and their communities and their spaces are always under question. And that's not the case for other groups that are able to make that transition into whiteness.
This is I'm really fascinated by this idea of hearing you talk about different success metrics in some ways, and different cultures and societies looking at what success means for them different, or different communities viewing that differently. And so is it simply a matter of breaking down this idea of what success is and expanding it, or how do you begin to get communities to understand that has more than one metric involved in it?
Well, I think one of the things that we do struggle with and have to sort of acknowledge is that the valuation of capital, especially in sort of like free and open marketplace, this has always becomes a question of free and open marketplace. Mm-hmm. Well, a free and open marketplace is also a marketplace that's affected by cultural norms, and those norms tend to devalue certain people, and the spaces that they're in become spaces that are problematic. So I'll give you an example from the work I'm doing in Central Florida, looking at a community like Hannibal Square, which is a historic Black community in Central Florida, in Winter Park, where my college is located. It has been a community of African American property owners since the founding of the town. If you look at the original plat map, the original town founders, when they laid out the town, they set aside lots for African Americans because they intended those lots to be for a labor force that they described in the original town plan, to be working in the field and working in the home. But they also said that those people had to build a house very quickly. So right away from the founding of the town, you have African Americans who are property owning, tax paying citizens of the town. But those people are also living in the midst of a post-Reconstruction South, where the political, social, and economic opportunities are limited by white supremacy, by racism. So their property, while they own it, is always going to be constrained by the fact that it is their property. They cannot value it in the same way as their white counterparts. They don't have the same access to capital, so improvements on their property, as in building houses, and they don't have the same access to markets. So where they can go to sell, like, say, for instance, agricultural goods, is always going to be constrained by racism. And so while they have, in some cases, held on to that property since it was deeded to them in the 1880s, if you look at the relative value of property versus their white counterparts in other parts of town who had property for the same period, that probably isn't worth as much. And it's not because they haven't owned property. It's not because they haven't paid their taxes. It's not because they haven't. Like, the thing is because, like, their property's in the black part of town, and they've never had the opportunity to sort of, like, be in the capital market in the same way as their white counterparts. And not to say that they probably hasn't incurred value, like the value hasn't gone up. It has. It's just in comparison to white property, it hasn't gone up as much. So when they sell their property, in the midst of displacement pressure that we might associate with something or gentrification, as you can see if you go over to look at the community today, they're not getting the same money for a lot that they would be getting if they were selling that same lot on the other side of the railroad tracks, right on the east side of the railroad tracks, where the wealthier community is and where higher real estate values predominate. So that question is a really important question, because when we talk about the transformations that are happening in communities, invariably those communities, they don't have to be communities of color, but of course, when we talk about infill in a lot of urban areas, who are the groups that have been sort of left in these urban areas? They tend to be African American, they tend to be Latinx, or the marginalized groups. Gay and lesbian groups are often characterized as urban pioneers, and some of the language we use describe gentrification. But they're urban pioneers because that's the place they can go where people will allow them to be. And the same can be said of racial minorities. Those are the places that they ended up when all other places were barred to them, either through segregation, as the suburbanization sort of transformed the city, American city in the mid-century, and so the spaces that are now under pressure with development are spaces that are not free from these sort of broader cultural narratives about race and place or identity and place. And these are things that the people who are there are painfully aware of, like their experience in terms of the systemic transformation of the community is very different from sort of the people coming in. And so you always have these sort of narratives of transformation that seem radically different from the people who are there, how they see it, versus the people who are coming in, who are, again, part of a broader systemic transformation. And so, those are the kind of questions I often talk to students about when we think about transformation in communities. And I hesitate to say gentrification, because I think gentrification tends to obscure the process sometimes as a description.
It's just fascinating to think about the state. I mean, we're familiar with these concepts of redlining, but the fact that these aspects of capital, that there's almost the stain of racism and property values is something that I don't feel like we talk about, even though we know many of the mechanisms that we use to get there. And I kind of wonder, how do we get communities to even understand that these issues exist? I mean, it seems hard enough in this day and age to get people to admit that racism still exists. How do we move beyond that to saying that there's complexities in the past systems play out even to this day and have impacts that are real and present today?
I think one of the things that we really have to do is to recognize how this process has deep historic roots, and how the market has sort of formed around the contours of them, right? So a prime example is, as you mentioned, redlining. Right? We completely understand at some level that redlining had a detrimental effect on housing values, right? But we tend to place that effect clearly in the past and don't associate it with contemporary circumstances. And that's really problematic, because from a historical standpoint, we fully understand that there was a history that got you to the point where redlining was a policy, right? Like, there was a history that got you to the point where redlining was the way they were going to do it. And that history was rooted in racism and sort of like racialized thinking. And even as the redlining was sort of like no longer the express policy, the consequences of the sort of restrictions associated with this is how we're going to allocate capital remain, right? Because on the redlining, you could not get a loan if you were in one of these HOA, FHA sort of designated poor areas. Well, we know how property development works. I mean, everyone who ever looked at a home and gardening channel understands houses are flipping, right? So if you don't have money to put into a house, how is that house going to be an active part of the capital marketplace around housing, right? Like, you have to improve the house to improve its value. So if you have a large swath of people who never had an opportunity to get access to capital to improve their house, they might own the house, but their ability to sort of maximize its value is tainted. And part of that taint has to do with the fact that they lived in a black area, right? So you're concentrating people in an area with less capital. And of course, because they have less capital to put into their house doesn't accrue the same value. And so the whole sort of like process of wealth accumulation that's been attached to houses is barred from this whole swath of people. And that's really important, because though that wealth accumulation fed into the creation of second mortgages that sent people to college. It fed into second mortgages that, were the heart of small business investment. It fed into the accumulation of, all manner of sort of like familial wealth, right? So that consequence, right, that very basic consequence is really important. And the desirability associated with suburbanization, where, the sort of white picket fence, the large lot size, that too is a sort of cultural narrative, but it does have the net effect of making these urban areas less desirable and therefore less profitable for a lot of people until, that shifts with, we see this sort of phenomenon of infill. But infill means that in order for people to really sort of maximize the value, what you see developers do, they come in and like they get rid of the established housing stock, right? Like they buy the houses, often rezone for higher densities because they're trying to maximize profits, and they create this sort of like displacement pressure, because even if you don't want to sell, that transformation means that your tax profile changes, and if you don't have the sort of income to sort of participate in this sort of changing tax landscape, that means that eventually you're going to have to sell, right? You're not going to have a choice. And then also you deal with the sort of like emotional consequences of like your community changing from what it used to be. And I don't want people to think that I'm saying like all change is bad, because one of the things that really sort of defines the American sort of like urban landscape, especially, is that it changes a lot. Like, Americans knock things down and build new things. We do it with our own houses and we do it with our cities. But often those transformations are there's some equitable participation here, right? When we add an addition to our house, we often take money based on the value of the house, refinance, and do a home improvement. Well, right there, that description goes back to the sort of core point. You're taking value from the house. This is a value that is sort of estimated by this wider question of like the desirability of the place that you're in. The desirability is associated with like the environment, how close you are to X, Y, and Z, how close are you to like amenities, how close are you to downtown, how close are you to like major thoroughfares. But it also could be how close are you to like a neighborhood that we don't think is good, right? And the neighborhoods that we don't think are good, more often than not, overlay are associated with neighborhoods that are poverty-stricken, like lower income neighborhoods, and those are often more than not associated with like racial minorities, right? And so it becomes like a somewhat twisted, interwoven tapestry of restrictions in terms of like access. And it's a vexing problem, but one of the first things you have to ask ourselves is like, well, why is it that these spaces have not had the same successes in terms of like urbanization as other spaces? And you can't just simply say, oh, it's the market, right? Like that doesn't really explain it every time. It's the market. That's a vague answer. I know people love it, like, well, it's just the market, but anyone who lived through the Great Recession, if you say, why did the stock market go down? Well, it's just the market. Well, that's not true, right? There's a reason the stock market went down, and it has a lot to do with something someone did, right? So saying it's just the market is not a really good answer.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Well, I'm intrigued now that, once you can get people to kind of recognize that the history is vastly important to the places that we live in now, and I think we're starting to see some recognition of that. I think some of your work resonates with that, but, here locally we have a group that's doing some LGBTQ history projects to kind of document some of that history before it gets lost. But I wonder, how do we, we seem to be in this place where we need to make sure we're documenting what could potentially become lost history in the next few years. Is that something that you're seeing? And if so, how do we kind of make sure that gets the effort that it needs?
I do think that this is a really important point, as I think we see many American cities start to pivot to a different way of developing. And what I mean by that is that our sort of like new generation of Americans, millennials, Generation Z, whatever label you want to put on them, are much less car dependent than previous generation, right? They're much less car dependent than the baby boomer. They're much less car dependent than Generation X. And so without a car, there's a couple of things that are sort of driving that. One is costs associated with housing. A lot of them aren't able, especially in sort of like pivotal early career period, afford housing in sort of externalized areas, right? Like you think about some of the nodes at the periphery of a lot of urban areas. They don't want to live that far. They want to live closer, and so they're looking for those areas that are closer to the urban core, closer to, in the case of some older suburbs, where they're doing their work and where they're doing their institutional sort of like engagements, right? So like whatever those may be, it might be church, it might be like social things. So they are creating a much different physical landscape, right? They don't necessarily want a car. They're much more cognizant of like cost too. So they don't necessarily want to carry a lot of debt, which is one of the reasons, we always talk about, well, they never want to leave their parents' house. Well, is that really stupid? Because they don't have to pay rent there, and they don't want to get debt. So living in your parents' basement actually is smart if those are your goals. Like, you don't want to take on a lot of debt, and you want to sort of like maintain a certain kind of lifestyle. You could say it's a failure to launch, or you could say, well, it's a pragmatic decision because, you know, their professional profile is such that they know they're not going to get in a corporate job, stay there, get a pension, and retire, right? They know they're going to be in a sort of like intermittent employment pattern. They recognize that their income is going to fluctuate. They don't want these sort of like huge capital outlays for an upkeep around a car. Can't yet afford the kind of cost associated with housing. Affordable housing is a real concern. Renting in many urban areas, many urban areas are rent distress, right? Like the percentage of your income towards housing is over 40%, which means that you're in a distressed place, right? It should be below that, right? It should be like 20%. So there's lots of reasons why they approach things very differently, but it also means that, you know, they like bike share programs, right? Because like they can get on a bike and go and do what they want. They want to live close to downtown. So they're creating like a new pressure for concentration, and that's leading to, I think, in a lot of places, like this kind of infill. But that's where the conflict is, because they're infilling into places where that were kind of left behind in previous like iterations of like boom and bust. So yeah, you do have to have like a conversation, and you really do have to have, I think, a question of what are we going to do for those people who are there? Are you going to have set asides for low income people? Because even though I think some of these younger people that are moving into these places are in their minds not necessarily making a lot of money, they're making more money than the sort of like low income urban poverty, low income people that they're in the areas that they're moving into. So, you know, questions about affordability in some of these places, questions about mechanisms to provide support for the elderly in terms of like, you know, their housing being sort of disrupted, and recognizing that these places have their own narratives, and the transformations don't necessarily always equal good. I mean, this is one of the things that students often sort of like say on the first day of class. Well, it looks better now from the pictures that we saw, so it must be better. That really doesn't do much for the people who were living in those places before, right? Like they might have grown up there, they were living there. The new housing construction that is sort of like plopped in the middle of the established sort of like community, it simply being new doesn't necessarily mean that like it's making everything better, because often that new construction represents like a tremendous sort of disruption to the tax and character, because it's often, you know, really different, right? Like, you know, you think of sort of like some modern duplexes dropped into sort of older housing stock and how they look versus everything else. So sort of like recognizing that history, ensuring that it doesn't, you know, affect the least able the worst, right? Like, you know, elderly people, having opportunities for people to have affordable housing. And this affordable housing question is increasingly not just simply a minority question, because we're rapidly moving to a place where it's just like it's an income problem writ large. It overlaps with race, but it's not completely defined by race. I mean, I see that in Orlando with some of the transformations that are happening in some of the adjacent neighborhoods to our downtown, and some of the sort of successful infill activities that happen in downtown Orlando. Now you see those communities sort of they reach a certain price point that people can't get in, so they're moving to neighborhoods right next door, and that's doubling the rent in some cases, right? And this is displacing sort of working young white people, and they were up in arms. And you're like, well, this has been happening to African Americans and Latinx people for a while, but yeah, now it's sort of spreading to sort of like your previously modestly priced neighborhood, because yeah, like that's how that process works. It is displacement, because we don't ever want to call it gentrification when it's happening to white people. Like it's gentrification when it's happening to people of color. It's displacement when it happens to white people. And I'm always telling students, like, look, that's displacement. Gentrification, and we can have enormous debates about that, but I often make the distinction, like, it's gentrification if there's nobody there, right? If it's an industrial district that has little or no residential character and empty factories or empty sort of warehouses or empty commercial spaces, and you start to rezone that and bring housing into it and, rehab some of the older housing stock, and it become like trendy eateries, well, you can make the argument that's gentrification. But if there are people living there and you start to come in, buy stuff, knock it down, build new stuff, and people with higher incomes move in, well, you're displacing people. Those people are being displaced, right? Like, and it's not illegal, but they were there, and now they're like, the market, they've been pushed to a different place. They are by definition been displaced.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what happens, because I think it's, there's the physical act of displacement, but I think that there's also potentially some harm that comes when even if people aren't physically displaced, when the narrative around their community is no longer their own. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how important having a narrative that speaks to you in your experience is.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that comes through the most in my work with African American communities, is that they are often not against development, which is shocking to people. They'll actually say, "Oh, I'm not against development," because like they too recognize that house sucks, right? Like they're not dumb. Mm-hmm. What they're against is development that is completely out of character than what they're right now, which of course is exactly the kind of development that a developer needs. Like they need to make a profit. So if you have a single family home on a lot that they can redevelop, rezone and redevelop like 4 townhomes on, so they could sell each one of those townhomes for the same price that they bought that entire lot, that's their profit. But it completely changes the character of the neighborhood. And so what a lot of, in Africa, I do a lot of oral history with community members, and they'll talk about just that. They see their community disappearing. And it makes them very sad and angry, and then sad, and then angry. Because part of the process of disappearing a community is the justification, well, there's nothing here now. And they're there right now, right? And there's nothing good here. And they have a lot of memories of good things that were there. And that, we're making it better. And at some level, this becomes very complicated, because the making it better is actually in some ways true. If you think about low income areas that go into this process of being transformed, how municipalities will start to do things like address street or sidewalk issues, or create new green spaces, or update already established playground spaces. And one of the things that come on, this is one of the narratives, like things are better now, like things look better now. And, the critique to that, like the response to that is like, how come you had to change it now? right? It's because all these new people are here. What about when we were here and we were wanting you to do a better job with the streets, or wanting you to do a better job with the sidewalks, or wanting you to put newer things into the playground. And the reality is that tax money, or the tax base, or the wealth of the people who are moving in exceeds that of the long-term residents. And so therefore, yeah, we're going to spend more money on that, right? Like, and they never, I don't think any sort of municipality is ever going to say, oh yeah, we're not going to spend money on X because of they're poor. But the net effect of this sort of like gentrification transformation often is greater outlays of services that are coming along with these newcomers, and these newcomers invariably are, wider than the sort of minorities in the space. That's not always the case, but majority of the time, like, when we visualize these things, we often see this. And of course, there are great documentaries about this sort of process. I often show a documentary called Flag Wars in class, and it sort of documents exactly that same thing. The older residents, in that particular case, it's Columbus, Ohio, I haven't seen it in a while, but there's sort of older residents, and the urban newcomers in that particular case are LGBTQ community who are coming in, buying houses, rehabbing them, and selling them, and really transforming the neighborhood. I mean, it's similar to what some of the literature talks about Greenwich Village, right? Like, you have this sort of like urban pioneer population, young people, arty people, who move into these empty structures, create a kind of hip culture, and then get like younger people, married couples, and it fundamentally transforms the place. And for those people who are there, who have long connections, all those transformations are a slow but steady erasure that they see every day, and it creates like a lot of emotional and psychological pressure, right? Like, we often see these sort of conversations as snapshots, like this angry person who's yelling at some meeting about this thing. It doesn't seem that big of a deal. But what you have to realize when you're looking at that is that you're seeing that thing. They're thinking about everything. Right? Like, you're seeing like some argument over signage, and they're thinking about the 18 things that happened before that everyone ignored. And so their anger is not, you're seeing their anger out of a context. You see it out of context. If you understood it within context, it would make a lot more sense, but you're seeing it out of context. And so, of course, part of this is that, the news always gets things out of context, right? Like, any sort of like urban unrest or urban tumult is often out of context. Like, the thing that triggered this upheaval, be it like a Ferguson or any number of future urban upheavals, is not just that thing. That thing is, for the people who are, out in the street, the latest thing, not the only thing. It's the latest thing. And so this is part of the reason why, narrativizing the community and allowing newcomers who come in to understand that history and be a part of the community, right? Like, I once said to a newcomer, like, yeah, I mean, you have a choice. Are you an advocate for the neighborhood, or are you an avatar of change, right? Like, and that's like not fair at some level. All I did was buy a house, they rightly say. But the history, often very, very long, very complicated, in a community is one that is really important. I mean, often people move into a community for some very practical reasons, right? Like, it's often very practical. I want to live close to X, or this place it's affordable which is a huge one, and I want to live close to X, and this place, meets my criteria. The consequences to the people already there are often not in your formula, right? Unless you feel like you're in danger, right? Like you never, like people won't move to a place where they feel like they're in danger. But once you eliminate the danger thing, they don't necessarily go, oh, I wonder what's the cultural history of the area, unless it's generic. At some level, I think a generic cultural history is usually a net positive, right? It's a hip area. So narratives like that are very common. But, it is one of those things where the more you know about the place, the more it can be helpful, I think, in terms of helping the community to navigate. I mean, one of the things that often happens with these transformations, of course, is that like the sort of established businesses disappear, displaced by new businesses, which have a very different price point in terms of the services that they're offering, if you know what I mean, right? Like if you think about the corner cafe that's replaced by, or the corner store that's replaced by a trendy cafe. Well, often with these transformations, the people who live, the established residents don't often go to those new businesses because they can't afford to go to those new businesses, right? So those new businesses are really beholden to the newcomers and not necessarily concerned about established residents. And, if you're the business owner, this makes perfect sense, right? Like eateries are a prime example. They tend to be like the avatar of these kind of transformations. But, is there something you could do? Well, I mean, I do think that one of the things that we don't do a good enough job is trying to like create support for established businesses to transition to sort of like new landscape, right? Like, is there something we can do to help them? Is there something that when we have these communities in transition, is there mechanisms that we can create to help train the people who live in a neighborhood to work in some of these new businesses? Like, that almost never happens. I think that's something increasingly we should think about doing. Like, we have all these sort of like accelerators for all kinds of businesses, but we probably need accelerators for people too. So they can look at their skill sets and go, is there a way I can slot into like these sort of emerging opportunities in this space? And that really becomes like a question of the state, right? Like, is the state going to help make that happen?
Well, I'm intrigued kind of by this idea that there is, perhaps, just to take a step back, the name of this podcast is Big Ideas for Better Places. But as you mentioned, that's a complex idea for what it means to be a better place. And this is something that I think many of us are coming to grasp with, that, there may be a standard list. Every community wants, a housing stock that's increasing in value and well taken care of. They want parks and playgrounds and things like that, and good schools. Right. So maybe there's some empiricalness to that betterment, but there's more than that. There's also it's much more complicated than that. You can't just go in and create those things, because we see that there's a component that makes that not just as simple as, you can't go in and make that happen.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one of the things that we sort of have to measure when we think about a better place is what do we mean by equity? What do we mean by defining better? Is it better to have the newest, best, hottest eatery, or is it better to have maybe something that's not quite at that price point, but more people who live in the community can work at or be patrons of. Those are really complicated questions, and collective mechanisms to try to create a more equitable space are really controversial, but invariably, I think these are things that we're increasingly going to have to talk about, in part because the problems associated with better urban environments aren't going away. They seem to actually be getting worse, right? Like, I think housing costs continue to be an issue for people. The question of employment and access to a living wage, that continues to be a huge issue for people. I think some of the problems around housing are actually, it's a local aspect of a global problem. What I mean by that is if you look at a place like Orlando, there are a lot of condo towers in our downtown in Orlando, and I haven't done it, but I'm sure if I went and looked, I would see that probably half of them, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say half of them are investment properties, meaning someone bought this condo as an investment. They don't have the homestead exemption, right? Which there's no crime against investing in real estate, right? They've been doing it since they've had real estate. But when you buy something as an investment, you kind of inclined for it to go up, right? If you're not going to live there, you really need for it to go up in value. But since so many people globally are sort of parking wealth in real estate, there's a great series of investigative articles from the New York Times about Chinese money in the New York real estate market, Chicago real estate market. And, you can make the same sort of investigation of Brazilian money in the Miami real estate market, right? But the net effect of that is since people are invested in the Miami real estate market, if you're looking for an investment, the prices there are pretty high, so you start to go north, right? And so eventually you get this sort of displacement pressure where the price of the real estate in Miami is affecting the price of real estate in Orlando, right? And this is part of the reason why Airbnb is so successful. If you think about it, this is part of the reason why Airbnb is so successful globally. There's a lot of property that's been bought by someone and they're I'm not going to live there, so I'm going to rent it out, right? And Airbnb has sort of stepped in and gone oh, well, we'll help you facilitate this transaction. A lot of the sort of share economy is about facilitating an asset that you can't really maximize value out of yourself, but there's somebody with capital somewhere in the world who can help you with that, right? Uber, they're in town, but Airbnb, they might be in Ireland and they want to come to Florida, right? If you think about it, that's what it is. It's somebody with money far, far away who wants something, and you have an asset that you really can't get more value out of unless you meet up with this person, right? We electronically bring you together. So in this sense, you're living in the future because it's like a replicator. Because someone's I want a house in Miami, and you go on into this app, and they're okay, here's a house in Miami, right? I'm a very geeky person, so that was a joke. But you see my point, right? There's a system of where capital and asset are being matched up. But prior to this moment, you wouldn't be able to do that. You would have to make this asset work within a relatively closed system, right? Local, municipal, state system. It doesn't matter if someone in Ireland wants a house in Miami in 50, 60 years ago. They could never, there's almost no way they could find you, right? You owning a house there is no use to them. But now it totally works, right? That's a complicated landscape, right? So we're kind of in a, this is part of the, I think, part of the anxiety that Americans feel, right? This is part of why we have this sort of like rhetoric around America first, right? Like, these people are taking my jobs. But that's not really true. But you can make an argument that there is a bigger system where you're going to have to put more effort into extracting value and creating value in, which is way, way complicated. And at some level, cities are right at the front line of that process. Right? They're right at the front line of that process, right? For everything from housing to employment, those are really big questions. And how are you going to be successful in that new dynamic space? Like, this is one of the reasons why things like the smart city is so important, right? Like, it's not, the economy here is worthwhile to think about. I remember when I was an undergrad, I remember the first time I read a really big book about the, sort of like robber barons. And I never forgot Andrew Carnegie's sort of like fixation. It wasn't on like making more money. It was on cutting costs, right? Like, he was talking about how much does this cost, right? Like, this is the way he made money. He controlled costs, right? Like, a lot of his decisions were about increasing the valuation around, like, so cutting costs. And, while he built an industrial empire in a period of, like, a wildly different regulatory state, at some very basic level, for individuals in a new urban environment, cutting costs also are a huge driver. Like, if you can cut costs, then you can live a lifestyle that you want, which is why kids don't have to buy cars. One person has a car, the rest of them share it via Uber, right? Like, so they're cutting a cost, and they're taking the money they would have spent there and spending it elsewhere, right? To have the lifestyle that they want. So they did exactly what Andrew Carnegie. They cut costs to get this thing they wanted, like a better, more efficient system. And we do that individually through the share economy, but how much of that can you do? Like, this is the question. How much cost cutting can you do before it dramatically affects the lifestyle that you assume you should have, right? Like, there's a story we tell ourselves as Americans about the lifestyle we should have. At the same time, you're being forced by broader systemic questions into, like, making decisions about the cost associated with, like, trying to achieve that lifestyle, right? And so you have these huge questions, huge tensions around these decision-making moments, and it's really important for us to recognize that, right? Like, this is part of the reason why people are anxious. This is part of the reason why politics is like so much of a turmoil right now. It's around those very fundamental questions.
Well, I wonder if as we come to a close here, if you could share a story that encapsulates how you think communities or cities should work, or what happens when a community or a city functions well.
Well, I think one of the things that that gives me really hope about the city is how small enterprise can help empower people to do better, to like improve things. So there are a couple of examples that I'll point to. Like in Winter Park, there is a community land trust, which, as some of your listeners might know, land trust is something that has its roots deep in sort of like social justice ideology from the early 20th century. It has different permutations, but the land trust in Winter Park was a direct result of concerns about displacement, right? it's a small land trust, but within its structure, by it holding land in trust and people owning houses, it makes housing affordable. It could be bigger, and I've done work with them for many years, and sort of like been on the advisory board, and sort of like talked about the history of the community, because like one of the things that the land trust, because it's the Hannibal Square Community Land Trust, one of the things that's really helpful is like having a stronger narrative around the community that they're trying to preserve by making housing affordable, the character, the stories associated with that. And so, this sort of cooperative action represented by a land trust or other sort of cooperative actions are really important. And I think that we'll see more things like that, if not a land trust or some other kind of cooperative. I think those are things that increasingly people turn to because individuals need to band together to sort of like operate with the strength in the market. And the other thing that I point to, the thing that really impressed me, is we have, it's been spotlighted in the New York Times, like something called East End Market, which is a kind of food hall in Orlando. And it acts as a kind of incubator for different kind of concepts. So if you walk in there, there's like a bakery, like a cheese shop, a bar, a restaurant, a little coffee shop, a little gift shops, but they rotate in and out, right? So the concept comes in, you have a relatively small overhead because you're getting like a stall in this space. You sort of like firm up your concept, and as you get a following, some of those concepts move into like their own independent spaces. And because of the success, I think because of the success of the East End Market, the whole sort of like commercial district around it is a lot more robust. And it's part of a main street, with one of several main streets in the city of Orlando, that sort of like act as like these sort of amplifiers of community, amplifiers of like commercial activity. These are all mom and pop operations. They're not chains. They're also like indigenous, I would argue, sort of commercial entities, right? Like small businesses and so on and so forth. And so there's always a lot of activity. Like there's a record shop in the Audubon Park district where East End Market is. Like, and if you know anything about the music business, the existence of a record shop should tell you something, right? Like it's a thriving record shop. They do like in-store concerts, and people line up out the door around the block. I'm like, who's there? I mean, is it the boss? Who? Like, it's just like some band. They have a massive community that comes out for, National Record Day or whatever. They have an ice cream shop. I mean, they have everything from like a gift shop with like a watch shop, but it's all in this same sort of like Main Street district. And I think arguably one of the things that sort of accelerated that was that sort of innovative space that was the East End Market. And it also supports more sort of social enterprise things like the fleet farming, which is a like organic local initiative that you can look up online. But those are two examples of what I think are increasingly going to be important. Cooperative entities that allow for people to sort of pool together their resources and sort of activate place, create the sort of vehicles for people to be successful. I think none of these things are simple or easy, but I do think that increasingly this question of what can we do to empower people to be engaged, to pool their resources, to work collectively, to sort of support community, encourage investment and engagement are going to be really important in American cities.
Well, Julian, I really appreciate you taking the time today, and it's been great to hear from you. Is there some place that if people are interested in learning more about what you do, where they can find more information?
Sure. You can check out my website. It's julianchambliss.com. And, of course, you can always check out my department website at Rollins, www.rollins.edu /history. And you can find me there. But julianchambliss.com is my personal website. You can always find me there.
Wonderful. And for those of you all listening that are interested in CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But Julian, again, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon.
Oh, thanks a lot. And good luck with your podcast and keep up the good work.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksxpo.com. Thank you guys again and look forward to seeing you next week.